chapter 21, we're looking at how the body maintains homeostasis in body fluids. So we'll be looking at water, electrolyte, and electrolyte balances, and at how we maintain pH balance, so acid-base balance. And so in this first lecture, we'll be looking at water and electrolytes. So the body fluids are composed of water. That's the solvent that dissolves everything. And then the solutes that are dissolved in that water. And if you look at the two sexes, in general, this is of course a generalization, average content of water is much lower in females than it is in males. And so the big question is, why the difference here? And it has, so I'll let you think about that for a minute. You can even pause your presentation if you like. Okay, so hopefully you're back with me now and you've come up with your answer. And the reason that men have higher water content than women do is that women have greater adipose tissue reserves spread out across the body. This is a consequence of estrogen. That's just one of the effects that estrogen has in the body, is to increase adipose stores. And everywhere you have adipose cells, there is very little water, because there's not much cytoplasm in an adipose cell, and the bulk of the volume of the cell is filled up with an oil droplet. Whereas males have higher muscle content in their body, and again, that's an average statement that I just made, but men tend to have more muscle than women do, and muscle has lots and lots of watery cytoplasm or sarcoplasm in it. Infants have even higher water contents, because if you look at their bodies and the proportions of their bodies, they have very large heads in proportion to the rest of their body. Try, if you've got a little baby at home, try stretching their arms across the top of their head, and then do the same thing with yourself, and you'll see that proportionally infants have downright huge heads. And so the brain it's a very, very soft tissue, lots and lots of water content there. And they have, relatively speaking, low body fat and low bone mass as well. So their bones aren't fully ossified, and so they have less bone tissue and more fluid-based tissues in their bodies. So body fluids have, of course, water in them, and they also have lots and lots of dissolved solutes in them. If water is the solvent, anything that's dissolved in that water is referred to as a solute. So solutes are the dissolved materials. Electrolytes are salts. These are the products of acid-base reactions, and when you dissolve electrolytes, they break apart, producing ions. So, for instance, sodium chloride, you put that in water, and so you make it aqueous, and it falls apart into a sodium ion and a chloride ion. Ions are atoms that have, or compounds that have either gained an electron, which is what the chlorine atom does when it becomes a negative, I should have done that right on top of the other one, a negative chloride ion, or they've lost an electron, which is why sodium is positive. That's a sodium atom that has given away an electron, so its overall electrical charge has become positive rather than negative, or rather than neutral. There's also lots of non-electrolyte or non-ionic compounds that are dissolved in water. Glucose is one of those. Proteins dissolved in water are not electrolytic. So when you dissolve glucose, or when you dissolve a protein in water, then it doesn't break apart into ions. And it turns out that electrolytes have a greater osmotic power than non-electrolytic substances, because they dissolve into, at minimum, two different ions, two different particles. And osmosis is all about the number of particles, not about the size of the particles. So even though proteins are really big, proteins are just one particle. Whereas something like sodium chloride, because even though it's really small, when it breaks apart into two different particles. So electrolytes have much greater osmotic power. They produce, if you dissolve, let's say if we had two different solutions, same amount of water, and we dissolved a tablespoon of sodium chloride in this water and a tablespoon of table sugar, let's say, in this one, what we would find is that the sodium chloride solution would have a greater osmotic pressure because sodium chloride falls apart into two particles, whereas sugar doesn't break apart at all. The sucrose solution is just going to be dissolved. It's not going to ionize. So magnesium chloride has even greater osmotic power than sodium chloride because it breaks apart into three particles, a magnesium ion and two chlorine ions, whereas something like glucose doesn't break apart at all, so I should have written only one particle. So the more particles that an electrolyte breaks apart into, the greater osmotic power that it has. And this has, clear implications in the body, because if you have salts on one side of a membrane or another, then that's going to affect the direction in which water is most likely to move by osmosis. Okay, so getting to that idea then, we talk about the body as having fluid compartments, so regions that are separated by membranes that have different fluid compositions. And so we can talk about intracellular fluid. That is by far the bulk of the fluids that we find in our body. About 63%, almost a third of body fluids are intracellular, that is, within or inside of a cell, while the other 37% is all extracellular fluid. If we look at the intracellular fluid compartment, then what we see is that it has a very different composition than extracellular fluids do. So ECF means extracellular fluids. So we have higher concentrations of potassium, magnesium ion, the phosphate ion, and the sulfate ion inside of cells than we do outside. Outside of the cells, or in the interior of the cell, intracellular fluid has lower sodium, lower chloride, calcium. This is the bicarbonate ion, and than the extracellular fluid does. That is not the bicarbonate ion. It should just be HCO3. Dadgum. I thought I had fixed that. I apologize. So HCO3 minus, that's the bicarbonate ion. There we are. Okay, I'm sorry I had to pause there for a second because something wasn't making sense. So, also intracellularly, we see an even greater concentration of proteins than we find in blood plasma. And that's the reason the interior of a cell has kind of a gel-like consistency, is because there are so many proteins inside the cell. Okay, so higher concentrations of potassium, magnesium, phosphate, sulfate, and higher concentrations of proteins. Extracellular fluids, on the other hand, there's a variety of fluids that we kind of lump together as extracellular fluid. So interstitial fluid is the fluid that's around cells. Plasma, we know what that is. That's the fluid in blood. Lymph is the fluid that's found in lymphatic vessels. And then there's transcellular fluid. What's a transcellular fluid? That's a fluid that's separated by other fluids because or by epithelial membranes. So cerebrospinal fluid, aqueous and vitreous humors inside the eye, the synovial fluids of the joints, the serous fluids that are, sorry about that, dang, there we are, okay, back again, the serous fluids that we find in between the serous membranes surrounding the heart, the lungs, and the viscera of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and inner ear fluids are all transcellular fluids. So all of those fluids collectively make up the extracellular fluid compartment. And if we look at the fluids there, we see that they have higher concentrations of sodium, the chloride and the chloride ions, of calcium of bicarbonate ion, got it right there, and much lower concentrations of potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate ions. And then if we look at all of the extracellular fluids alone, so if we look at that extracellular fluid compartment, of course, blood has the highest protein concentrations because of all of the proteins that are placed into blood that are not allowed to leak out again into lymph or other body fluids. Okay, so you can see the differences here. So much more sodium extracellularly than intracellularly. So much more potassium extracellularly than intracellularly. And recall, this is all because of the sodium potassium ion pump that reestablishes membrane gradients after action potentials, and that maintains those differences in concentrations, and then a variety of others for a variety of reasons. So we're not going to go too deep into all that. So how do we move fluids between the intracellular and extracellular compartments? Well, hydrostatic pressure, and among even the extracellular compartments that we just talked about. So hydrostatic pressure is a big mover. We talked about that, about how at the arterial end of capillaries, hydrostatic pressure moves plasma out into interstitial fluid, and then tissue pressures will move fluids on into the lymphatic vessels. We talked about how colloid osmotic pressure can also move fluids. So at the venous end of capillary networks, colloid osmotic pressure pulls interstitial fluid back in again. Osmosis among cells and between cells and interstitial fluids will move those fluids either way. And then the sodium-potassium pump, as it moves ions into, or let's say, as it moves ions in and out, remember it moves out 3 sodium and sends in 2 potassium. Well, that's going to also force fluid out as well. So anytime we do any kind of ion pumping, then fluids are going to follow those ions because of osmosis. Last of all, water balance. I think this is last of all. Let me double check this. Then, oh no, this is not quite last of all. Water balance exists when our water intake equals our water output. And so water intake is all managed at the hypothalamus. So if the body becomes low on water, then the hypothalamus will secrete or will produce nervous signals that will increase the desire to drink water, and so we become thirsty. So it's in the thirst center of the hypothalamus that all of that is being managed. So where do we get our water from? Well, about 60% of it comes from the fluids that we drink, and approximately 30% of it comes from the waters that's found in moist foods. So as we eat oatmeal for breakfast, or as we consume a steak, we're consuming water along with the other materials that are being eaten. Last of all, there's the water of metabolism. This is a crazy idea, but when we run this chemical equation where we take 6 glucoses and react it with 6 oxygens. On the far side, and of course we're pulling out ATP here, that's the cellular respiration reaction. Then on the far side we produce 6 waste carbon dioxides, and we also make 6 waters. How cool is that? And so there are actually some mammals, the kangaroo rat that lives out in the southwestern deserts is one, that never ever drink water. They get all of the water that they need by eating dry foods like seeds. And then the water of metabolism, that's those 6 water molecules that are made, they are so good at conserving that water that they don't need to drink any other water, which is just amazing to think of. Now they pee out a pasty, if you can imagine this, this would be sounds horrible. They pee out a pasty urine rather than producing a really liquid urine like humans do. But through their body processes, they are good enough that they can conserve the water that they produce through these chemical reactions of metabolism and meet all their water demands that way. Water output, it's through urine, is the primary means. About 60% of our water is lost through urine, but we also lose water as feces, because feces is a moist material, through sweat. Sensible sweat is the sweat that we notice. Insensible sweat is the sweat that evaporates immediately. We don't know that we are doing insensible perspiration. And then as we breathe out moist air from our lungs, or we even lose water directly across our skin. It's not a completely waterproof membrane, so we also lose water that way. So electrolytes, of course, just like we can imagine with water balance, electrolyte balance is maintained as we, for every electrolyte that we're losing, we're replacing it with another electrolyte. So electrolyte intake occurs primarily through the foods that we eat, but we also get electrolytes in water because when we drink water, it's never ever pure water. Well, it can be. If you drink distilled water, you would be drinking pure water with no other ions in it, but it has a really unappealing flavor. So we actually like it when there are some ionic compounds in the waters that we eat, some mineral content to it. So we get electrolytes through water and other beverages, and then chemical reactions produce electrolytes as well. Anytime we do we react acids and bases together, we produce electrolytes. Deficiencies in electrolytes can result in salt cravings. So our body will tell us, hey, we're really low on salt. So that doesn't mean that you should, just because you're craving some salt, doesn't mean you should go eat a bag of potato chips. That may just be, that craving may not be a genuine, your body needs salt, but it can result in cravings. So some of the important electrolytes in the body include sodium, potassium, which are both directly involved in action potentials, calcium, which is important for signaling between neurons to pass that's the signal for releasing neurotransmitters so that we can get or action potentials to go between neurons. Magnesium is important frequently in building enzymes, but there are other places that magnesium is important. The chloride ion is involved in neuron signaling. The phosphate and bicarbonate ions, they are the result of chemical reactions in the body, and they're important in acid-base balancing. And then, of course, the hydrogen ion is very important, just because that's one of the big controllers of pH. If there's a lot of hydrogen ions, then we become acidic. Electrolyte loss is primarily through urine, but it can also be lost through fecal material, and electrolytes can be lost certainly through sweat. And so, of course, the sports drink industry is trying to convince all of us that we lose so much that we have to replace them. The minute we break a sweat, we need to replace them with Gatorade or Powerade or whatever. Probably not quite so true, but they're certainly working. They're working it. So how do we control water and electrolyte balance in the body? Well, we regulate them through a couple of hormones. Aldosterone is secreted by the adrenal cortex, so the outer rind of the adrenal, and it acts at the kidneys, forcing us to reabsorb sodium and secrete POA, potassium ions. So this is how we maintain sodium-potassium balance, is through aldosterone. And of course, as we're maintaining, or as we're retaining sodium, even though we're losing some potassium, we're likely to also retain water. Parathyroid hormone, it's released by the parathyroid gland, 4 little nubs of glandular tissue on the posterior of the thyroid gland. It stimulates the activity of osteoclasts, and because of that, we release calcium ions. I didn't mean to mark it out, I was just trying to underline it. And it also causes us to conserve calcium at the intestines and reabsorb calcium at the kidneys, there at the nephron. And because we're breaking down bone, we're releasing lots of phosphorus and phosphate ions, so we wind up excreting. We do tubular secretion of phosphorus at the kidneys. And as we retain the positive ions, then frequently negatively charged ions, like the chloride ion, are going to be retained or lost through passive reabsorption and secretion, just like we talked about back when we were talking about the kidneys. You know, as we move sodium across a membrane, that frequently will just drag chloride ions along with it. Then as electrolytes are moving between extracellular and intracellular fluids by osmosis, we also draw fluids. So fluid balances and electrolyte balances are very closely connected because of the power of electrolytes to influence osmosis of water. All right. So there it is. Everything you've ever wanted to know about electrolyte and water balance in the body. You know what to do. If you have questions, send me an email, drop in on me during office hours, or make an appointment with me at some other time if my office hours don't work. Be good and study well, and we'll see you in the next lecture.